welcome to another episode of my podcast, One Woman is Twice Two Soldiers. I'm your hostess, Caitlin, with 20 plus years experience in sewing and 12 plus years experience within the hobby of living history. This podcast explores things such as myth debunking, historic wardrobes, various bits of research that I have gone down, as well as some of how I've incorporated living history or the things I've learned from living history into my everyday 21st century life. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, I would love it if you consider subscribing and following along. Last time we finished up our little mini series on food preservation in the mid-19th century, and this time I thought we'd go back and talk about the fundamentals of living history and where it differs from costuming. I feel like my audience has grown enough to where there's a lot of people and a lot of subscribers and watchers who weren't here several years ago, and it's important to go back and talk about such things. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started. I'm sure most living historians have their own definition of what is living history and why it's important, of course. Most of this is going to be my own personal opinion, but there are definite differences between living history and costuming. And I feel like my thoughts have somewhat evolved from what I thought even 2 years ago. Let's first define some terms because I feel like most people don't even know what living history is or think it's synonymous with costuming. And I see a lot of costumers using the term when I don't think what they're doing is warranting the term living history, just because it's a cool sounding term and it makes it sound really nice. And I think the lack of solid definition is somewhat leading folks astray. So I'm going to define costuming as getting dressed up for fun in non-regular clothing. For the purposes of this video, we're going to talk about historical costuming, which is getting dressed for fun in clothing that resembles or emulates clothing of, let's say, 50 plus years ago. Costuming is done primarily for the wearer because they like something about the era or the clothing that they are wearing, and sometimes because they are getting together with other costumers for a get-together such as a private event or a tea room or just picnicking together, something like that. There are usually few to no guidelines on what to wear or how it's supposed to be constructed or the fabrics you're supposed to use. Costumers may have events in public spaces such as like picnicking in the park, or it may take place in a public space such as a rented out room or building, or maybe let's go to a tea room during opening hours. Or it could be somewhere private, such as an event center that's rented or someone's private home. There may even be some historical clothing guidelines at costuming events, but they do tend to be less strict. But the purpose is to really look good and hang out with friends for personal reasons. And it's done entirely for pleasure and not for education. Now, living history also involves historical clothing, but the events tend to have clothing standards ranging from relatively loose to extremely strict and specific. But although the clothing and the get-together would be the vast majority of what historical costuming is, that's a very small part of living history. Living history is largely skill and knowledge-based in a lot of the areas of the time period being portrayed. Meaning it's not just about the clothes, despite what my channel is mostly about. The purposes of living history is not just looking good and hanging out, although those certainly are perks. But the primary focus of living history is education. And there are just so many more layers within living history. Also, reenactments are different than living history events to a point. Reenactments can be living history focused. They can also just be basically county fairs. Or, as my friend Annette often says, camping with a theme, which I really appreciate. I struggle a lot with the appropriateness of most reenactments today. There are both pros and cons, but I do think that conversation does not belong necessarily in this video because this video is probably going to be long enough already. So let me know if you want a living history versus reenactment video, and I'll see if I can fit that into the schedule someday. So why is living history important? I've been doing living history for a while now. I also was at some point in time a homeschooled child whose mother was really into field trips. We went on so many wonderful field trips as a child, and where I'm sure I learned a lot of things. We went to more modern museums, historical ones, we went to parks, grocery store tours, like behind the scenes type things, all sorts of things. Of the historical ones, do you know which ones I actually remember the most? It's the ones where people were dressed up in funny clothes and they showed us how something worked, or they let me do something. Those were the ones I remember the most. For some reason, having someone dressed in period accurate dress in a period accurate surrounding doing period accurate things clicks in our brains, in our little human brains, where we actually remember something much more than if someone were just lecturing or telling us about something, or even letting us do the thing, but not necessarily in a period way. It's when you get the whole experience as close as we can to replicate the past today, then I think we get a better understanding of history. I've also spoken to others I know, and even friends who aren't living historians said they seem to recall more in the experiences where they had a more fully immersed experience in whatever period was being talked about. Living history captures the imagination and the whole brain, allowing the public to better retain the information given. This is both a good thing and a bad thing, right? When false information is given by someone in historical dress, things can get pretty dicey. I have found the public holds information given by someone in period dress in a much higher regard than they otherwise would. I cannot count the number of times I have been argued with by visitors because some other interpreter somewhere at some point in time, sometimes it was in the room above me, sometimes it was a really long time ago, gave them false information. And even when I had period sources and I was showing them and backing up all of the things I was saying, they wouldn't believe me because the other lady said so. This creates a certain level of responsibility on both costumers and living historians, actually. The public doesn't always know the difference between the two, and it's important that costumers and living histories be very careful not to go beyond their knowledge if they happen to deal with the general public. So living history is not costuming. Living history is actually so much more than costuming, and that's not to say that costuming is bad or that it's not as fulfilling as living history. It's just that living history encompasses so much more than just costuming. We have different objectives and spheres within the two types of camps. It also doesn't mean that a costumer can't become a living historian or that a living historian can't enjoy costuming. I have friends that are way more knowledgeable and authentic than I, who've been studying for a lot longer than I have, who are fantastic living historians, but also do steampunk or history bounding, or also just random costuming events. A living historian can also do costuming just like a costumer can if they meet certain requirements, and I don't want to use the word upgrade necessarily, but move over into the living history realm because there are some elements of both that are the same. However, living history is not an offshoot of costuming, nor is it an extension of or encompassed by costuming. I used to see things as sort of a big bubble where costuming and then you have a smaller bubble in it that would be historical costuming and then a smaller bubble inside that would be living history. But the more I have experienced things, the more I realize that is just not true. That's not the case. The clothes actually are a very small part of living history, what it means to be a living historian. Therefore, living history cannot be fully contained within the historical costuming or costuming in general bubbles. So now I see it more as a Venn diagram, which is two circles and they intersect at one corner or one side. I suppose circles don't have corners. You think I know that teaching first grade for 8 years. So there are things that are the same, there's the parts they intersect between living history and costuming, but there are a lot of things that are different. In the intersecting section where both things are similar, things such as wearing historical clothing, etc., but then the differences are put in the areas of the circles that where the two things are not similar and not intersecting. So now that we've discussed the differences, we're going to mostly lay costuming aside and focus on living history for the remainder of this podcast. Although I do dabble in costuming from time to time, and I did start off in costuming, I do not teach costuming on this channel. My focus is on living historians, and my channel is about living history. When I talk, I am always talking to living historians unless I say I'm talking to costumers. And this does not mean that I don't appreciate the costumers who watch the channel or I don't think costumers will get anything out about what's going on the channel. I love that there are costumers who want to do things right, who come here to see the originals, who try to get their costumes as close to the original garments as they choose to make them. Honestly, the closer you make your costumes to the actual garments of history, the more options you have, and that maybe down the road you wanted to delve into living history. You already have some clothes that may work or with some tweaks would work for that. But notice that I don't refer to the clothing that I make on this channel as costumes. I don't see them as costumes. They are reproduction garments or replica garments often, which is just another way of saying the garments for living history are held to a higher standard than costumes. Now, the word costume is a great period term, especially for the 19th century where it was used in place of the word outfit. So you could have a dinner costume or a dinner outfit in modern terms, or a walking costume, which words we would say a walking outfit. But because costume means something different to people today, I don't use that word to describe the garments that I make and wear for living history because the word means something different today than it did 150 years ago. I don't use the word costume for these garments unless I am in character or I am quoting a period source. because they aren't costumes in the modern sense of the word. And again, that doesn't mean that I don't enjoy the costumers who enjoy the channel or watch the channel. I actually love that there are costumers that are interested in real history. They can take what they want from the channel's information and ignore the rest because they are costumers. If a costumer wants to make and wear a solid color cotton dress in the style of a period silk or wool fashion plate, I don't care. It's a costume. Go ahead and wear it to a picnic or a tea party and feel beautiful. Just don't wear it to a living history event because that does not closely resemble an actual garment of that time period. Living historians get much less leeway in how they're going to make their reproduction clothing, and that's the primary reason I get strict on this channel. Because this channel is for living historians and we don't get the freedoms that costumers get. We get to do things right for educational purposes. So let's now talk about living history. So let's start with the types of living history. So typically most living historians fall into two types of interpretation. That would be first person and third person. First person would be in character, using the language, words, syntax of the era that they are portraying. You take on a historic persona, usually a real person, although sometimes it is made up from data of real people, but you're using like a fake name. And you are that person for the duration of the event that you are attending. Third person is where you are usually in the clothes doing historical things, but you are using words such as they would have or they used to. You're talking to people in modern terms about the people, but still doing things correctly. You're talking about the people in the past without being a person in the past, if that makes sense. Both versions of living history are totally valid. There are pros and cons to each type. If you're just starting out, I would highly recommend third person. It allows you in much more flexibility in how you respond. And if they ask you a question that you don't know or that your character wouldn't have known, you have better options for saying, I don't know that. Than you do when you're in first person. It's always better to say I don't know than to give false information or to make a guess, even if it's an educated guess. Now, I don't mind saying I don't know, but here with all my years of experience is what I would think, but this is just a guess, like I don't know. Come back in 3 months and I might have an answer for you because now I'm going to have to go research that. One has less opportunity to say I don't know in first person, but there are ways around it. For instance, I'm going to use a recent first person event that I attended as an example. It was set in the 1830s and we were at Washington, Nebraska State Historic Site. I was portraying Mrs. Lott, who is the wife of the proprietor of Lott's Tavern. And the event was actually David Crockett coming to Washington on his way to the Alamo. So him and his men were staying at this tavern. So we had Wade portraying Mr. Crockett, and Rhett, my husband, was one of his men that came with him, etc. So we were completely in character if there was public around. In the sections where there was not public, we did laps because we're all good friends, and sometimes we don't get to see each other very often. So when we get to hang out in person, it's like, oh, as soon as there's not public around, we are no longer in character, which is fine because we're only supposed to be in character for the public. It's for education purposes. Now, the best way to do first person is to have an intermediary, a staff member usually, who can introduce the public to what's going on, give them a brief description of what they may see, give them the background information, and tell the public, hey, everyone in that building is in character, so you can talk to them as if you're really that person, if it's really 1836. So for the Crockett event, that was my friend Jennifer. Jennifer actually works at the site. She's extremely knowledgeable and actually knows a whole lot more about a whole lot more things than I do. She's really good with politics of the time period, which I am not. When there is public in the building with us, Jennifer was also there with us, and she was in modern dress. She helped prompt the visitors to ask questions when they were required, or she sparked conversations with the living historians for the visitors to listen to, and she also helped to clarify questions and responses between the parties. There's nearly 200 years difference between the 1830s and today, and so that's a lot of room for language and customs and mannerisms to change, and an interpreter is great for that. You don't have to have an interpreter for first person, but it really helps. It also helped a ton because if a visitor asked me as Mrs. Lott a question that I don't know, but Mrs. Lott would have known, then I could quickly point them out to Jennifer. And a great way to do this in character without breaking the character or seeming like you don't know anything would be the question of how many people stopped by in Washington on their way to the Alamo. I didn't know that, but I assumed Jennifer probably did because I was like, you know what, I'm pretty sure Jennifer's going to know that. But I can't look like I don't know that because I'm Mrs. Lott. So it's a very specific question. It's an excellent question for that event. I just happen to not know that. And so, because we had an intermediary, I was able to respond, oh, most of the inns in the area have been very busy with all the people heading down here. Speaking of, if you'll excuse me, I had to go put this meat pie in the oven. Otherwise, these men are not gonna have anything to eat, and I don't want to have to deal with all these hungry men. So if you'll go talk to that lady over there, I'm sure she'd be happy to answer your question, and I'll come join the conversation when I have the pie in the oven. I didn't have to speculate on what I didn't know. I didn't have to break character, and the public got good, period, accurate information. Now, if the public had asked me a question that I didn't know, and Mrs. Lott wouldn't know, then it would be very correct for me to say basically something along the lines of, I have no idea. An example of that would be, how many days did it take Davy Crockett and his men to get here from Tennessee? Now, so Mrs. Lott wasn't a part of that journey. She was just providing them lodging for a few days on an IOU from Crockett. So unless she had actually specifically asked them, which if I'm feeding and lodging a bunch of men on IOUs and not getting paid, I'm probably not going to talk to them too much. So she would have no way of knowing that unless she actually specifically asked. So to that question, I would have responded, oh, that would just depend on what road they took. I haven't had a chance to speak to them, so I don't know. They just got here last night. I have been so busy cooking for them. I have 8 children that are running around I need to take care of as well. There are other visitors in the area that are not with Mr. Crockett, but you know what, that gentleman right there, he came with them. If you go talk to him, he was part of that journey, he'll be able to tell you. And I just point the questioner to the living historian I think would be more likely to know that answer. And sometimes it really is just knowing the people you are doing living history with and what each person studies and who is going to know what. Because everyone has a niche that they study, and not all of us know everything, so it's nice to work together to give the public a good experience. Do I know anything about surveying? Absolutely not, but those nice men over there have surveying equipment, and I know they know a lot of things, so why don't you go talk to them? They'd be fantastic information. With third person, though, you have a lot less of a chance for the public to trip you up, although there's always going to be the middle schoolers who point out in the sky and go, what's that? When a plane goes by. I just tell them my eyesight is poor and that I can't see 10 feet in front of my face. And then I ask if they've been to the bakery yet, because the bakery has really good bread, but it's not as good as my bread. So you need to come by in 2 hours to taste my bread. But if you go over to the bakery, they have bread now, and come back in 2 hours. I want you to tell me, honestly, whether my bread is better than their bread. Just give a period response and then redirect them. That's the best advice I have for middle schoolers. With third person living history, you have none of those issues, and you're able to meet the public where they are at. As you get better within living history, you'll be able to switch back and forth. I've had first person events where the person is just not understanding the concept of first person. And you can see that just based on their thought processes and how they're asking you questions. You're like, okay, they're not getting this. And so if there's no one else around, I have no issues with breaking character and just talking to them where they're at. That's not a problem. I can usually do it pretty seamlessly where they don't feel like they're missing something, and it's just easier for everyone involved. I've also randomly switched into first person at third person events because someone comes up to me and talks to me like I'm a 19th century person, and people ask different questions, they talk to you in different ways when they're talking to you like a 19th century person, and it's like, oh, okay, but I've done this so long that I'm like, oh yeah, sure, I can talk to you in first person, that's not a problem, and I just do it, it's fine. It all depends on each individual and their past experience with dress interpreters, whether they expect you to be in first or third person. And I'm usually very happy to adapt to whatever situation. I don't really care. Now, if it's one person talking to me in third person and I have somebody who's not understanding the first person concept, I might tell that person, hey, I'm actually not in character right now. If you'd like to talk to me as a 19th century person, let me talk to these people, and then we can do this all day long. That's fine. I used to not be that comfortable adapting back and forth. It's just years of practice, honestly. And years of experience have given me the knowledge and the confidence to adapt like I can now, which is a lot of fun. I like adapting to people. Now, my current thing I am working on is to improve myself when talking to adult members of the public. I am really good at dealing with kids. This upcoming year will be my 10th year teaching public school, and 8 of those years were in first grade. I know how to deal with children. I have years of experience and a whole college degree on working with children. So no matter where I'm at, what time period, doesn't matter if I'm not even owning the house, I'm just there visiting. As soon as a kid pokes their head through that door, I'm going to have them doing something. It's, oh, you 3 look strong. There's a wood pile out back and my wood pile in here is getting low. Will you each bring me a log and bring it over here, please? I've had kids fetch wood, gather eggs, sweep my floor, fetch water, bring me an ingredient, run a message to another living historian, churn butter, doing some of my mending or sewing, even if I had to take it out later because their stitches weren't up to my standard. Really anything that gets them involved and happy. I'm really good at doing that with kids. I can put kids to work whether they belong to me or not. I have a much harder time connecting with adults. Personally, I don't like initiating the conversation because I don't want to talk down to them or make them feel stupid. Sometimes they respond if I just narrate what I'm doing, and other times they just stare at me and I don't really know what to do because it's I don't want to talk down to you, describing what I'm doing when you can clearly see and you may know actually a whole lot about this. But I also don't want to talk way above your head and just not make you feel good. Like, I don't want any of that, so I just don't know what to do with adults half the time. I'm great with adults who are very interactive and who initiate the conversation, or at least respond when I try to initiate, and then like ask more questions after I initiate. But I have no clue what to do with the ones who just stand there and watch even when I try to engage. I have friends who are absolutely fantastic at involving aloof adults, and it's an area that I'm trying to do better. Now that we've discussed first and third person, let's talk about the two types of living history events. Those are going to be public events and private events. Basically, public events are where the public is invited to come out, and private events are events where it's just the living historians. There are some private sections at public events, so like an after hours thing, where the public's there during the day, but we're still doing living history things in the evening. Sometimes in character, sometimes not. Sometimes it's just hanging out, in modern terms, just again, hanging out, catching up, that sort of thing. It depends on the event. I actually used to not understand the purpose of private living history events because, again, the main focus of living history is education. If there's no public around, you're not educating them. So, like, why are we here doing this? As I started to attend private events, I very quickly realized that private events with living historians who know more than I do is how I learn. So those events and those experiences are educating me so that I can be a better educator when I'm around public at public events. I learn way more when I don't have to focus on the public, but instead can focus on how I'm interacting with other living historians, how they interact with others and me. It allows me to practice the language and the syntax of the period without having to worry about misleading the public. I can get corrected by others in a safe place, and I have the space to practice those things so that they are in my working memory by the time I get to the public. It also allows me to practice things such as serving a meal, interacting with others based on my station, experience how a community works, all without having the distraction of the public. It is one thing to read something, it's quite another to actually experience it. I can accurately describe the feeling of being surrounded by Comanche on the Texas frontier with no weapons and just me and a friend I just met. I could imagine how terrifying that would be and how we would potentially get out of that situation, but actually being put in that situation, now I'm able to really talk about it. Like, I know exactly what was going through my brain. I know how I was feeling. I know that the best way to hide is to go directly under the window so that when they look in, they can't see you. They're looking out. Just hopefully you don't have two on the opposite side looking in at the same time, because otherwise you're kind of in trouble. But that's when you hide behind the stove in there. You just kind of have to be careful living out certain scenarios, because that one in particular has caused me not to be able to sleep in a schoolhouse again. Like, I can't do it. I cannot go to sleep. All I do is think about that experience, and I can't do it anymore. So, but I do have a greater understanding of what frontier life was like in the 1860s. So, I mean, there's that. In those types of situations, it is very imperative that there's either usually a safe word or a phrase that, or the opposing party very well, so that modern boundaries and lines aren't crossed. In that situation, I knew at least one of the Comanches pretty well, and I could have been like, okay, this isn't working anymore if I really was not feeling it anymore. Now that we've talked about the types of living history and the types of events, let's talk about accuracy. There's also people who don't like this conversation, but it does need to happen. So remember, this isn't about costuming. This is about living history. Accuracy is vital within living history. If we are going out to educate the public, then we need to give them the best available information in order to educate them. There should be strict, although fairly basic guidelines and standards. No, you should not be allowed to wear any synthetic clothing at a living history event. That is fine for a costuming event, but synthetic clothing is not safe at a living history event. Fire. There are so many fires in living history. There are candles, there are lanterns, there are cook fires, there are hearths, there are fire pits. There is so much fire. You do not want to be wearing synthetics. We already have enough people having heat exhaustion issues. Polyester does not help the situation. You are not allowed to be mad about being told that you can't wear synthetic at a pre-20th century living history event. It's not just an accuracy issue, it is a safety issue as well. You also do not get to be mad if your clothes are not the right time period. If it's the mid-19th century and you're trying to wear something that's 10, 15 years out of date, be prepared to be told no. It's not an insult, that's history. Unless you have actual historical research backed up with several primary sources and interpreted through a period lens and not a modern lens, then yeah, what you're trying to do isn't history, it's fantasy. Living history and living history events are not a chance to reenact your romanticized version of the past. That's what costuming events are for. Current research stands that the vast majority of women, including very poor women, or were remaking their dresses every 1 to 2 years to keep up with changing bodies and fashion. So you can either take that 10-year out-of-date dress, pick it to pieces, as they would say in the period, and remake it into a more modern style, or obtain or borrow a period-appropriate dress, or provide through primary documentation for your choice. And no, my impression is poor and this is all she could afford is not thorough primary documentation. Wearing short sleeves during the day as an adult woman or going without a corset would be very, very rare. And no, providing random photographs of women in short sleeves or who look to be corsetless to you is not documentation. You don't know who those women were, what they were doing, what their social class was, how old they were, where they lived, etc. Unless you can fully document all of that and your impression matches that and that exact situation is the same, and you get told yes by event coordinators, then no, you shouldn't do that. Getting told that your outfit isn't up to event standards is not an insult, it is a learning opportunity. I have also been told to tweak things for events, and as long as the event coordinators have primary documentation for the things that they are asking of me, I don't mind adapting. If I have period sources from that area documenting what I was trying to do, I might push back and say, hey, I have these sources, have you considered these? But I'm still going to follow the event coordinators if their research is solid, and if it's not, then I just don't go to that event. If our standards aren't aligned, then that likely just isn't the event for me. So if you get told, hey, that photo isn't up to our standards for this event, don't get butthurt about it. Ask for clarification. If it's something you can easily amend or fix, consider doing so. Or maybe make a new outfit or even borrow one if you really want to attend. Or if nothing else, you can always just attend as a spectator. Being told an impression isn't up to standard is a learning opportunity for the living historian, not an insult. And I've had to deal with that situation about any way it can go. I have been an event coordinator or at least on a committee to approve or deny impressions where we were lashed out at or snarked on behind our backs because of high standards. We've gotten people to tweak small things in their impressions. We've learned things from people who were able to provide extensive documentation for these choices, etc. And on the flip side, as a participant and not a coordinator, which I usually am just a participant, I have been told to fix a few small things, some of which I have generally learned something new and was able to adapt my whole impression from that point forward. And other times I've been able to document my choices and either had the event coordinators go, hey, I see where you're coming from, but for this event, please don't. And sometimes change entire impression guidelines in my favor because I was able to document what I was doing. It can go all different ways. But being told no shouldn't be taken as an insult. Again, it is a learning opportunity. Most events have a best, good, acceptable, not acceptable policy on just about any number of clothing and personal items, and it's not a problem to not have an impression that's at the best standard as long as it falls within the acceptable. And all this really comes down to, or should come down to, ratios. I've given extensive talks about ratios in the past, but just briefly, let's just say there's an event happening in some town in Georgia in 1859. Let's say there were 50,000 people living in this area in 1859. About 18,000 of those are adult women. So let's say we have 36 adult female living historians coming to this event. That means that each living historian is representing 500 women from that community because 36 goes into 18,500 times. And when you look at it like that, whatever choices that you may make in your dress, hair, mannerisms, and speech should on the whole represent a full picture of about 500 women in that area. Can you document that 500 women were not wearing a corset? And don't forget that 500 women that you are representing have to actually somewhat look like you. All the same gender, they have to be the same general age, skin color, etc. So that narrows it down even further. Now, all of a sudden, those odd choices that may be okay in certain situations are suddenly not appropriate when you remember that you are representing 500 women. And now let's just say there's this crazy family who lives in this town. There's a wife who wears pants and has short hair, etc. One of those 36 living historians is going to portray her because she's some sort of local famous person and visitors are coming to meet her. So now you have to take her out of that 18,000. She's not representing 500 women anymore. She's representing one. Now the other women, the other living historians, have to pick up that slack and represent the rest of those 499 women that she is now no longer representing. That makes the likelihood of them being able to do anything that's even slightly different even smaller. It ups the ante, so to speak, for those other living historians, and it's important to keep all that in mind when preparing for or planning an event. If you are not willing to meet the basic standards, you should not be attending living history events as a participant. Go and be a spectator. Living history events are not parties for customers to come stroll around to get their picture taken in with visitors. Just because you have a pretty or even accurate clothing does not mean you get to come in your costume to stroll around in a pretty background. It's actually a personal pet peeve of mine. If we're interpreting, let's say, a Western frontier 1830s town, and the living historians are portraying members of that town with specific roles and jobs, it's insulting and honestly very rude to come waltzing in your super fancy silk dress with no specific role or job other than to look pretty and get compliments from visitors. You're not adding anything to the event, you're actually detracting from living historians who worked really hard not only on their clothing, because I realize that you as a costumer worked really hard on your clothing, but the living historians didn't only work on their clothing, they also worked on all the items they brought, the skills they are demonstrating, the language they're using, the syntax, the facts they are teaching. And shame on anyone who thinks it's appropriate just to waltz in and steal the show like that. Living history events are not like Ren fairs where they welcome both staff and visitors to dress up and interact with others. And I think a lot of costumers get confused and think that any place where folks dress up in historical dress is for them as well, which is just not the case. Do not ever attend a living history event in historical dress without first speaking to the event coordinators to clear everything. That does include who you are, who is coming with you, what you are wearing, what you are doing, etc. It is so rude to show up and parade around like you're one of the living historians who put so much work in addition to their clothing, so please just don't. Even as a living historian, everything should be clear through the people putting on the event. If I wanted to do as a living historian something different than what everyone else is doing, then I would definitely clear that with the event coordinator before just showing up and doing it. It's insane to think that just because you wear historical clothing that you can just show up and do whatever you want, even at a public event. And as a living historian, if an event coordinator tells me, no, please don't do that, when I bring up an idea, then the answer is no, and I'll just not do it. I'll do whatever the event coordinator or the host site asks of me because my main goal is to help them put on their event so the public learns a valuable history lesson. Just because I think it'd be fun to show this little facet of whatever from history doesn't mean it actually meshes with the goal or tone of the event. And I can accept that. But if you plan on showing up in historical dress to an event, clear it with the site or coordinators first. That should be basic human decency. And if you get told for whatever reason, whether it's accuracy or if they just don't want people parading around without a job, then either don't go or go as a spectator. Be a costumer at fun private events. Now that is not to say that we can never get to 100% accuracy. No one is 100% accurate. Even the best are working at a solid 95% on a good day. Most of the cotton today is 20th century varieties, dyed with modern dyes, spun and woven on modern machines. The sheep today are different. They have different qualities. Their wool is different than it was 150, 200 years ago. We can't even get 90% of the fabrics they had 200 years ago today. We will never get to 100%. You could wear 100% original clothing and you are still not accurate because that clothing looks and feels 150 years old and it wouldn't have been 150 years old 150 years ago. So that is still not accurate. None of us are at 100%, but we ought to be as close as humanly possible as long as it is safe and available. We cannot get 100% wool chalet and period prints anymore. Few to none exist, and that was a very popular fabric back then. But we can get a good quilting cotton that looks and feels like a period wool in a period print. So maybe we treat that fabric as a wool and make it up as a wool dress. Again, we get as close as we can as long as it is available and safe. That is why it is not appropriate or acceptable to wear a print out of a solid colored cotton fabric for the mid-19th century. Solid colored cottons were not generally used for dresses, except for white. White wasn't considered a color. So it's technically an exception. Solids are found in silks and wools. And we can get solid silk and wools today. We can also get some good cotton prints and also good cotton plaids and stripes. So because we have safe and available alternatives to a solid colored cotton dress that would not be appropriate, it is therefore not appropriate to wear the solid colored cotton dress. Period bonnets exist. So the Amazon or Etsy with vaguely Victorian shapes and hot glue trims are not acceptable. If you cannot afford one of the real silk or straw bonnets, that's okay. Buy a kit and make it yourself for a quarter of the price, or make a sunbonnet with $10 worth of material and tools. No, you cannot make up that fancy fashion plate in quilting cotton fabric. That fashion plate is labeled as silk. You cannot switch fibers like that in the mid-19th century. Save up to make that gown in silk, and in the meantime use a period cotton and a period cotton dress design. Using a Battenberg parasol for anything pre-1980 is not acceptable. Find a cheap period one that you can recover, or use a pretty sunbonnet instead where you do not have to have a parasol. The white blouse with a cotton skirt is not a period option for the mid-19th century. We have period options. You cannot wear a solid cotton blouse with a cotton skirt in the mid-19th century. You can do a very nice white sheer bodice with a silk wool or sheer skirt, or you can do a solid color wool top with a silk or wool skirt. That's appropriate, but you cannot do it in cotton because we have safe and available alternatives that are period. Zippers didn't exist in the 18th century, and yes, we can still see that invisible zipper in your 1770s dress that you're trying to wear. There are safe and available appropriate closures that we have access to, so no, zippers are not acceptable. We have safe and available period options for all of those, so we need to use them. Now, this whole conversation is going to bring up some objections and complaints and excuses that are often heard. One is, oh, it's just a hobby. For some of us, it isn't actually a hobby, it's a job. I know a lot of people, a lot of my friends, this is their job. Those people definitely do not get that excuse. I have seen some very poorly dressed, paid people who call themselves living historians. But yes, for a lot of folks, this is indeed a hobby. But again, if you are dealing with the public, then you need to do things right. If you are not willing to do so, maybe you need to consider costuming, not living history, because with costuming, you can wear whatever you like. But when you are in front of the public, it matters what you wear and how you present yourself. Another excuse I hear is, oh, the public doesn't know any better. Really? We're gonna give folks false history on purpose? That's the excuse we're gonna go with. First of all, that is just not appropriate for people who say they care about history. Secondly, the public often does know better, they're just too polite to say it to your face. I cannot count the number of times that at a reenactment I have had people come up to me or a group I'm with and say, thank you for doing it right, because we were getting very discouraged walking around and seeing nobody doing things accurately. They say it to us because we're dressed accurately and they feel safe doing so. And they want to thank us for doing it correctly. They don't tell the costumers cosplaying as living historians that, because they're too polite. They come up to the people doing it accurately with a huge smile and thank us for doing it right. The public deserves better, so we need to be better. I've also heard excusing poor clothing choices because they want to teach a younger generation to love history, so we're just putting them in vaguely old-timey clothes. There are a lot better ways to get kids to love history. Take them to an actual living history event in modern clothes and let them do all the fun things. Ask to borrow period-accurate clothes from others for your grandkids or kids or whoever you're trying to take to a living history event. But if you're letting them play dress up in Amazon costumes or clothes scrounged around from Goodwill, you aren't teaching them to love history. You're teaching them to love playing dress up. There are appropriate ways to dress children cheaply, but dressing them in theater-quality costumes is not history. And finally, the final complaint I often get is it's too expensive to do things right. And that leads us to our next section, living history in a budget. First, I find doing working class outfits is going to be far more budget friendly than the super wealthy, fancy impressions to start off with. I started living history in high school when I didn't have a lot of extra cash. My first set of chemises, drawers, and petticoats were all from a 100% white cotton sheet that I got from Goodwill for $10. My first hoop was a polyester one that I got at a garage sale for $5. I took it apart, used 3 yards of a $1 white cotton to make a good cover for it. So basically I got an $8 hoop skirt out of that. My first real dress that was non-costuming was a $10 cotton duvet cover in a period blue plaid that I got from Goodwill. I was gifted shoes, I paid $10 for stockings, and I made a sunbonnet out of $2 worth of cotton from Walmart. I used scrap cotton and hoop wire from my first hoop for my first corset. $45 for an entire outfit that was decently period correct. At least it looked really good from the outside. I still have that first dress. It's probably 13 years old. I've remade it like 3 times, and the inside is a living nightmare because there's like 4 different lining fabrics and it's like piece within an inch of its life. But it is a labor of love and period piecing techniques, is what I like to say. It is actually currently on display at a museum as a touch and feel garment, so we don't let them touch the original garments, of course, but if they wanted to feel what like a dress looks like or take it apart to see what the construction is, I let them do it with that one next. Now, of course, I have dresses in silks and wools and fancy stuff, and fancy cotton prints and sheers, etc., but that's like a dozen years of collecting fabrics when they go on sale. 90% of the dress silks I have purchased have been $12 a yard or less. Which, by the way, $9 a yard on sale is how much I paid for the polyester 1860s costume ball gown that I did when I was into costuming. I used way more fabric in that thing than was period appropriate, so I probably spent as much money on that polyester ball gown than I did in any of my silk dresses. I'm really good at hunting eBay. I belong to Facebook groups where you can buy a dress length of silk for like $150 now, even nowadays, which is still expensive, but silk is something you can save up for and have one nice good silk. In the long run, saving up and buying something that is appropriate will save you money in the long run. Buying a cheap costume alternative is throwing money away because you still need to save up for the good thing after you purchase that. And you'll end up donating a costume item to a theater group or to Goodwill, and that money spent is gone. It is always better to do without than to buy a bad attempt at something vaguely period. And when the groups I follow, there was actually recently a whole debacle, and some folks got their feelings hurt when they were told that Battenberg parasols were not appropriate for American Civil War. There was I can afford an 1860s parasol. Understandable. I mean, half the originals I bought were well over $100. I spent $20 on probably 3 or 4 original 1860s parasols. I have a friend who recently bought 2 parasols, an 1850s one and an 1860 one, for $75 on Facebook Marketplace. They don't have to be expensive. And do you know what? You don't even need a parasol. So here's what you do. Instead of buying that bad parasol for $25 on Amazon, you buy a yard of cotton for $4, and then $4 a chipboard or peaches and cream yarn, and use a free pattern to make a sunbonnet. You can use a period cotton plaid, or a print, or a stripe, or even a sheer or semi-sheer white cotton or linen to make your sunbonnet if you want like a dressier bonnet. And for $8, you have saved money, and you don't even need a parasol for that. So you can save the $18 that you didn't spend, and you can add to it so that eventually you could afford to maybe buy that nice silk or straw bonnet and a parasol when you find a good deal and items go on sale. Then you can sell your sunbonnet to another living historian because it's appropriately made and get at least as much as you paid for it, if not more, because it's already made up. Or you can keep it and just have 2 bonnets. Living history is only expensive if you want it to be and can actually afford the expensive stuff. A lot of great living historians I know have their entire kit for less than $150 and are happy with the one outfit unless they luck into the steal of a deal for a different dress or fabric. There is no reason to spend buckloads of money on ladies' clothing unless you want to. Now, there is somewhat of initial investment. Yes, $150 is expensive, but any hobby is going to be expensive. And as far as hobbies go, that's not expensive at all. I know some people who spend a lot of money on their hobbies. That's not too bad. You may have to save up for it till you can actually get out to an event with your period appropriate clothes, but it is doable. There's no reasons to spend buckloads of money on ladies' clothing unless you want to. Now, some of us want to, and we have the funds to spend on it. Others want to participate and don't have the extra money to throw around, but for about as much as you spend in that poor quality costume, you can scrounge yourself a highly authentic, a high quality historic outfit with a little ingenuity. You don't even have to have a sewing machine. Most of my historic clothes are 100% hand sewn, and a lot of originals are too, especially pre-1860. And there's also nothing wrong at going to a living history event as a spectator, finding someone dressed right and befriending them, and then getting part of a group where maybe you can borrow certain pieces until you're able to afford your own. Some sites even have closets with extra historical clothing for volunteers. There's no need to stress yourself financially, nor to settle for historical inaccuracies. You can have it cheap and accurate. It does not have to be an either or. Just a few months ago, I was able to dress out 6 volunteers for a museum in perfectly period correct clothing, from corsets to chemises, stockings, dresses, petticoats, hoops, everything except for the shoes. I did have to make them get their own shoes because I don't have feet. My feet don't fit everybody. 6 whole ladies, most of whom were college students, plus myself and a few docents. That's because I've been doing this for a while, and so I have the extra clothing. And when I don't have or doesn't fit a particular person, I know people I can borrow things from. And so even a small museum event can have accurate portrayals. There really is no excuse for blatant historical inaccuracies within living history. There's always a way to set a high standard and meet it when there's a will to do so. So now we have our clothes. Now what? I did say that clothes were only a very small part of living history. As long as you have the clothes and a skill to demonstrate, you are golden to start living history. Everything else comes with study and practice, which is a time thing. Begin with third person, you'll thank me later. And the skill doesn't have to be something complicated. If you have an 18th century butter churn or have access to an 18th century butter churn, making butter can be your demonstration. Learn about period dairy practices and talk about that and how it differs from today. You can demonstrate hand sewing a second petticoat and talk about fabrics and sewing techniques and the steps that you're doing. Basically, you just need something that you know somewhat about by way of authentic first-person period resources. Not told to you by another living historian or memories from your own education growing up or a Google search. Actually research, and from there you can branch out.
Take your butter making over to someone else for an hour or so and listen to them talk about what they're doing. You get to make a friend and discuss a new skill with them. If it piques your interest, you can ask for sources and go look into it when you get home to gain more knowledge. Then slowly and surely you'll develop period knowledge and skills, and you'll feel more comfortable and confident within living history. As you research, you'll get better at period language and knowing what words to use. For instance, like what time period can you start using hello as a greeting? And when do you need to find other greetings for visitors because hello wasn't used yet? That's one of the many reasons to go back to the primary sources. You're getting the information straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak, and you are able to talk about the subject in a period way using period language. Don't be surprised if after a while you get invited to start a whole new time period, and if you have the ability, make or borrow some clothes from that time period and maybe research a skill that you've learned in that era so you can go demonstrate it. Welcome to Living History. It is a combination of clothing, skill, language, mannerisms, experiences, etc. It is not just the clothing. Another reason to go straight to the primary sources is that you are eliminating any interpretation or misunderstanding than if you were to get the information from somebody else, even a seasoned researcher. It is always better to go to the source. Now, there's no harm in getting a list of suggested period sources from others. That's actually great networking, and there's no harm in asking someone you trust that if you run into something you can't understand on your own. There have been some fabric terms lately that I cannot find definitions for, and I have gone to people who know way more than I do for clarification. Recently, I ran into an 1870s wrapper that had a very weird mix of period techniques and modern make-do such as snaps. The fabric felt like really weird upholstery fabric, so I was thinking it has to be reproduction. But several of the techniques read as antique, and my gut just said it was old. But the fabric and some of the modern theater updates were really throwing me. So I messaged Marna Davis, and I was like, hey, what the heck is this? And I learned a lot about 1870s wrappers that day, and yes, how wools did change in the 1860s and 1870s, and that was an original wrapper, and yes, the honk and thick contrast piping was a fad and not unusual for that particular time period. She showed me pictures of another wrapper in her collection with the same type of fabric, and that is what a good researcher friend will do. They will not only help you when you're stuck, but instead of just saying this is how it is, they will send you primary sources and examples to back up their response. If anyone cannot give you a primary source for something they do or say, or has given you the I read this, or I was told this before, or this just makes sense, or this is just logical, or this is what my grandmother told me, or any other type of excuse that doesn't actually involve a primary resource or a secondary source, I suppose, which is acceptable in the absence of primary sources, then that is not a good researcher friend. That is a customer who's gotten a bit too big for their britches and thinks they know more than they do without any justification. Also, when you go to the primary sources, you vastly reduce the chance that you are to get hearsay, old research, or conjecture. And yes, I did say old research. Research is always evolving. We always learn new things, new sources come to light. That is not scary or bad. A good researcher and a good historian will always adapt themselves. 10 years ago, people were telling others to use peaches and cream or sugar and cream yarn in their mid-19th century dress piping. Now, some dresses, particularly 1840s dresses, have piping that thick, but the vast majority of original dresses have itty-bitty thin piping. So that is now considered old research. Now, I still have a few reproduction dresses that I am slowly but surely, as I get a chance to wear them again, taking out that piping and redoing it correctly, replacing it with the more typical size piping. New research is not scary or bad. Having to adjust, adapt, remake, evolve your wardrobe or research is the mark of a good living historian, someone who doesn't let pride get in the way of historical accuracy. Just because something met authenticity standards 15 years ago does not mean you get to be mad today when told that it's not up to current standards. You ask for documentation, you adjust where you need to, and you move on knowing that in 15 more years there will likely be other things that we better understand and will need to adapt. That is what a good living historian should be, a person who wants to demonstrate history to the best of their ability, as close as they can, and that does involve changing their impression once new research comes to light. My philosophy with historic clothing is as long as you start with a period fabric, you can always adapt the clothing when research evolves. If you start with the wrong fabric, you will always have the wrong fabric and it will never be right. But as long as you have the right fabric, you can adjust that waistline or change the piping. If you have the wrong fabric, it'll just never be right. The information you give out is the easiest to adjust as you learn new things. Sometimes you may find that a tool that you use is just slightly later than you thought, and you may consider buying an older version of the tool. But that, again, isn't a bad thing. If your clothing and your information and your knowledge has not changed in 10, 15 years, then you really ought to start taking a serious look at yourself and your impression, because things ought to be changing and evolving. If you need more information about being a researcher or being a good researcher, I have a whole video on being a good researcher, and I have another video on free or cheap ways to perform research that I actually use, and I will link those in the description for you. So, final thoughts. Costuming is for private fun, living history is in front of the public, and is also fun. Costuming isn't bad, costumers aren't bad, but they also aren't living historians and shouldn't attend living history events as participants unless they are willing to adapt themselves to a living history sphere. Living historians, or people who work with and educate the public about history, have to hold themselves to a higher standard than costumers. It just requires different knowledge and standards. Being authentic as a living historian isn't optional, it's vital, and yes, the public does know and recognize when you're not authentic. The age of the internet has caused a lot of problems, but it has made information more readily available. And you'd be surprised at how much the general public actually knows about historical clothing. If you don't want to be authentic, go be a costumer at a costuming event. You can still play dress up, but then you're not telling lies and misinformation to the public. And that will just about wrap up this episode of One Woman is Twice Two Soldiers. Thank you so much for listening to my opinions of living history and why it's important. Next episode, we're going to look at old-fashioned chicken tending or poultry care in the mid-19th century and look at some chicken breeds that are available in the mid-19th century, specifically the 1850s. So be on the lookout for that episode in the coming weeks. If you have any questions or comments, or find me on Instagram or YouTube under Caitlin Kearns. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of One Woman is Twice Two Soldiers. If you did, please leave a review on Spotify or YouTube and share this episode with your friends. Also, please do not hesitate to tell me what topics you would like me to cover in future episodes. Have a fantastic week, and I'll see you back here in the next episode.